This is the Troutbitten podcast.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Yeah, Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
It's about trout.
Wild trout. This is Troutbitten. This is the Troutbitten podcast. It's episode 12, and we're here to talk about nymphing tactics. Specifically, how we take tightline principles and that tightline advantage over to an indicator nymphing system. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dominic Swantowski, and I started Troutbitten 7 years ago with no intentions for anything other than a simple fishing blog. But it grew quickly, and with the support of readers and now listeners like you, Troutbitten has become my career. The website, featuring nearly 800 of my own articles, now receives 1.5 million views each year. There's a Troutbitten YouTube channel, a Troutbitten shop, and now this podcast series. And a lot of what we discussed tonight is supported by detailed articles on the website. So, fly fishing for trout is about a lot more than just catching fish. A couple weeks ago, in episode 10 of the podcast, I did a reading of a story titled The Kid. And the memories that built that story really had nothing to do with the trout. What I remembered about fishing with my friend in that story were the places, the weather, the shared experiences, the closeness and friendship, and the tangible feeling of walking through the wet woods with a purpose. But listen to that again, with a purpose. As dedicated anglers, we strive to catch trout everywhere we go. And we learn quickly that improving our technique improves our catch rate. So our daily goal is the same: to fish hard and fish better, to approach a piece of water and give the trout excellent, realistic looks that are hard to refuse. We know that with refined skill and tactics, we can often make something happen, even on slow days. And there's really no better way to consistently fool trout in all conditions than to get good drifts with a nymph. These small aquatic insects are the primary food source for most trout. And with nymphing skills, we don't need to wait for rising trout or a streamer bite. All that is to say that being a nymphing angler is a sustainable and successful approach. We can do it all year long, anywhere that trout live. So what's the best way to nymph? That's what we're here to talk about this evening. My friends and I will dig deep into one of the best ways, a nymphing tactic that I call tight line to the indicator. Because when tight line or Euro nymphing fails, for a variety of reasons, the answer most often is to take those contact principles, that tight line advantage, and combine it with an indicator system. Because the indy allows us to do things that are simply impossible to do on a pure tight line system. This is going to be a good one. But first, let's do our question and answer round and introduce my friends. Here's my buddy Trevor Smith. Trevor, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Good evening.
Trevor, here's your question. How does wool continue to insulate when wet? Everybody tells you that. Hey, wool stays warm when it's wet. Why is that?
That's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Indeed.
I don't know all the technical reasons for that. I do think that, I think some of it has to do with the fact that wool doesn't.
Where's the science?
Yeah, wool doesn't saturate as a fabric. It doesn't absorb water like the fibers, like cotton does.
Okay.
So it quickly passes water onto other layers, but wool's a fairly non-linear fiber. So it has like a lot of like ridges and kind of curves in it. And so it produces this kind of almost sponge of insulating activity.
Nice.
I mean, you've actually got me curious now to find out some more technical details about it. Yeah, you kind of got me there. So I have guesses, and I think the natural oils of a sheep, like the lanolin, certainly probably plays a role in that hydrophobic quality.
Interesting.
In that it doesn't pick up a lot of water. But again, I'd be probably speaking too quickly before I check my facts there.
I figured that it was all the crinkly fibers just held more air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty good guess.
It's kind of what you were saying there with the non-linear.
Yeah, exactly. It just sounds smarter when I say it.
Good point. I like it. That's good. Hey, here's Bill Dell. This is Bill Dell. Billy, what's going on?
Not much. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. We spent a little time together guiding today. Well, 8 hours today guiding together. And then Bill raced home to do the podcast. Thanks, buddy.
Good.
Hey, Bill, how many flies do you lose on an average trip? Not a guide trip, when you're fishing yourself.
Probably 2 or 3 in the trees or the rocks. And then I've had a bad go of it lately. When I'm rigging up, I keep dropping them in the river.
I hate that. Uh-oh. They never even get a chance.
I did it twice. It's like, that's a pretty fly. There it goes, right in the river.
Do you ever find them?
So when I have a magnet on my net sometimes, I'll drag it over around the area and sometimes it'll pick it up.
That.
A lot of times, if you're in like a spot that has a lot of big rocks and boulders and they just wedge underneath it and you can't even see them. But if you can see them, I'll net them out.
I have a friend who takes that as a sign, or if he drops the fly in the water he was going to fish, that means he shouldn't fish that fly, and he picks a different one out of the box and ties it on.
So this happens to everybody. That's good to know.
That's funny, because it's entirely your own fault that you dropped it.
Right.
But I guess that's interesting. It's a
All
sign.
right. Here's Austin Dando. Good evening, sir.
Hey, how we doing?
Hey, Austin, what's your favorite streamer? Simple question.
Oh, sure. That's a simple answer. Favorite streamer is the jigless jiggy.
I knew it.
Now, no, people aren't going to know what I'm talking about. So
no, it's like the pseudo pheasant tail.
Really?
You ask him what his
Hold on.
favorite pheasant tail is. It's a pseudo pheasant. Go ahead.
If you're familiar with the craft fur jiggy that Dom has written pretty extensively on the site, it's just the same principle with 2 tones of craft fur with a ice dub body on it in a dubbing loop with a hotspot collar. So I like the olive over cream with the black pheasant ice dub body and a red hotspot with a copper bead.
Cool.
That's the one.
But it's not on a jig hook. That's why it's jigless.
On a straight shank hook. So that's why it's jigless.
Is that your favorite fly year round, or is that just a winter thing, or what?
Honestly, it's my best streamer all year round.
Really?
Yeah.
That's neat. You gave me one, and I definitely caught fish on it. Now I lost it, so I'd like another one, please.
Okay.
Did you drop it in the water?
Yeah.
I fished it first. I'm pretty sure I put it in a tree.
Well, we'll rectify that.
All right, let me mention that we are without our buddy Josh Darling this evening. He's traveling with family, and we miss you, Josh. Okay, good stuff. Let's dig into the topic at hand. Nymphing, tight line to the indicator. So it's hard to argue with a tight line approach to nymphing. And I should say, this doesn't mean we are in touch with the nymph all the time, but it means we have contact available whenever we want it. And that's a real advantage, because with contact, we're in control of the fly while also having great strike detection. These days, tightline nymphing is more popular than ever, but it often gets lumped in with Euro nymphing, which is all right. But Euro nymphing is really tight lining with nothing attached to the leader but the flies. So no split shot and no indicator. Remember that. A while back, I wrote an article titled Beyond Euro Nymphing, which I'll link to in the show notes here. And the point of that article was that the popularity of Euro nymphing is great because it puts the amazing tool of a tightline rig in more fishermen's hands. But few anglers these days take that rig any further than Euro nymphing. And that's too bad. In episode 5 of the Troutbitten podcast, we talked about the supreme versatility of fishing the mono rig. So go back and check that out if you're interested. We addressed how we take that tight line advantage beyond Euro nymphing to streamers, to dry dropper styles, dry flies, and here we go, to indicator nymphing. So let's jump in here, guys. How do we do it and why? Let's start with that, and then we'll get into the details. What does this rig look like? And what is the tight line to the indicator approach?
So for me, it's pretty much my same mono rig. I'm fishing 30, 35, 40 feet of mono into a taper of maybe 15 pounds, 10 pounds that are each maybe 1.5 feet. And then I'm going into the sighter that's probably maybe 1 foot. And then at that point, I'm attaching tippet to that sighter and then usually putting 2 flies, one off the tag, one as a point fly. And then the way I fish it, the majority of the time is I put the indicator on the sighter material. And so I'm, casting it upstream, letting it come back to me, or to about even with me. Sometimes a tad bit downstream. It depends on the situation.
So the rig is, you're saying 30 to 35 feet. It's a long butt section, a pretty short taper, then a sighter, and then your tippet.
Yep.
And you don't use a tippet ring, do you, Bill?
No, I tie blood knot.
It doesn't matter.
You tie blood knots, yeah. Here's why I do think it matters, at least in my mind. Yeah. And this isn't a huge point, but I sometimes, if my tight line to indy rig hangs up and breaks off, it often's going to break at the tippet ring. And I hate losing my tippet and my indicator. And so when I can, I will keep my tippet short enough that I can put the indicator above my first tippet ring.
Yeah.
And thereby kind of keep my rig intact as much as possible and not lose my indicators.
Gotcha.
So the way I combat that is leader-wise, standard Troutbitten monoliter, but is the tippet sizes. So going off of the tippet ring, I use a tippet ring. I'll often go 4X for maybe 2 feet, and then 5X for 3 feet. And then my weakest point in the chain then becomes my junction of the 4X and the 5X. Mm-hmm. And I like to mount my indy on the 4X because it's a little thicker, doesn't twist as much. It also doesn't burn the line. If you use a slidable system, it also just holds better. It doesn't slide as mad. But also, if it breaks, you're breaking at the 4 or the 5X instead of the one solid terminal piece of tippet going to your flies from the tippet ring.
Right on.
Sure.
So I'll pretty much mirror that. That's almost exactly my setup too, Austin. Sometimes I'll go 3X to 4X, but usually I'm 4X to 5X for the same reason. I like to mount the indy on that 4X. It's a little more stout. It's more abrasion resistant.
Yeah.
So essentially what we're doing, just so we all understand, is we're taking a tight line rig, which again, a long butt section, a short taper if you want it, and a sighter. And then beyond that sighter, we are adding the indy. And Bill said and some of us at some times will add the indy on the sighter itself. Fair enough. But for the most part, one of the things that really makes a tight line system work is we are limiting the diameters of tippet, of material under the water. So for me, I'd rather mount the indy right on the tippet section itself. But that can create not some problems, but some issues that you have to make sure you deal with. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the ways that Austin and I are saying we deal with it is by using something that's that can withstand some of that abrasion of going up and down.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the butt section here is long enough, and let me point this out. One of the real downsides of using a Euro fly line or a competition fly line, we're using a leader that's 30, 35 feet, sometimes even a little bit longer. The reason, I think I speak for all of us here, the reason we do that is so that we don't have any knots in the guides, pretty much at any point.
For sure.
Yeah. Because we streamer fish with this too, but we also, when we're fishing this tight line to the indy rig, we're shooting line a lot of times. One of the reasons that we do it, and we'll get to more reasons, is we want to fish further away often than we can wade out and effectively pure tight line. So I am often shooting line through the guides. And like Austin put it a couple podcasts ago, it's like when you have the transition from leader to fly line, or you have knots in the guides, then it's like speed bumps. Yep. That's how Austin said it. I like that. Yeah. So for me, I think for you guys too, I want a leader that's long enough to keep, that transition out of the guides. And I also want a taper section that's short enough that's going to keep the transition out of the guides. It's a big deal. Fulling Mill is the world's leading producer of flies, fly boxes, hooks, beads, and tippet. Known for their barbless hooks, they have many of your favorite trout patterns tied barbless. Not only that, they feature patterns from anglers like George Daniel, Pat Weiss, Josh Miller, Joe Goodspeed, and many others from around the world. Every pattern is backed by the 200% Fulling Mill guarantee. If a fly isn't up to the highest standards that you expect, they will replace it with two that are. Stock up at fullingmill.com or ask for their flies at your local dealer. Whether you're on the water or at the fly tying bench, Avid Max has you covered. AvidMax.com offers an impressive scope of premium brands and products to help you achieve your ultimate goal, success on the water. Their catalog of over 19,000 products includes everything a fly angler or a fly tyer desires. With fast shipping and expert knowledge, you get the gear you need when you need it. Listeners of the Troutbitten podcast receive a discount when shopping at avidmax.com with the coupon code Troutbitten10, no spaces. Enter the code at checkout to get 10% off your first order. From high mountain streams to the salt flats, AvidMax has the gear and expertise to elevate your game.
So I have a question. And so one of the clients we had today, do you think fly line versus mono line, you can, like the mono rig, you can cast it further? And so I said, yeah, to me, you can fish with the mono rig and an indicator effectively for a much longer distance than you can from fly line, because your fly line isn't on the water and the different seams and currents are affecting that.
Yeah, it's really tough to mend your line when you've got 50 feet of line out.
Right. That's one of the huge advantages. I agree, Bill. We can do this much further away. And it seems maybe the opposite. Well, the fly line will let me get it out there further. Sure it will. Well, maybe it will. But then what are you going to do with all that line that's out there?
Yep. And
you have to mend. Now you're putting yourself out of contact. And it's very difficult to mend effectively, too, over and over, and to keep things going and to not have tension on that indy. That can be a great way to do it. And it takes a certain skill to be able to do that. But yeah, what we're doing here, I'd agree, Bill. You can do it at longer distances. Now, not super long, and I want to clarify that I don't really like to do it beyond, let's say, I'm going to put 35 feet. I'm going to say 35 feet is kind of it for me. And I don't really like to do all the things that it takes to cast 40 or 45 feet. You can. And we'll get into throwing different indies for distance and stuff like that,
So I think we all use this, guys, and I think we find it effective, and I think it's a very useful tool. But I don't know, with clients and other people, it just seems like it's I don't know if under the radar, or it's not widely accepted. And so I don't know, what do you guys think?
I think I've mentioned this on a previous podcast, but I call it bobber fishing if I have an indicator, a bobber style of thingamabobber on my leader.
Although sometimes it's yarn. I'm jumping in there just to say, sometimes it's yarn.
Sure. So,
and those are almost two very different things. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. All right. Well, let's talk about bobber fishing. If I'm using a thingamabobber, I said this on previous podcasts. I think it has a negative connotation that, if you're fly fishing, you shouldn't be using a bobber, or it's something you can only do when using a fly line system. And when you go to a purely mono leader, that bobber, or that maybe it's viewed as a crutch, should go away with it. When really it's just another tool.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'm the type of angler, I just want to use every tool available to me. I use split shot and weighted flies, and I'm going to use indy tactics, and I'll use tight line tactics. And honestly, what we're doing here is super, super effective, because you're combining, the best of both worlds. I think another reason that this isn't more popular, or let's say widely known, is it's not talked about much because it's not competition legal. And a lot of the Euro nymphing or tight line tactics, a lot of the industry information out there is driven by the competition fishermen. They're great anglers. But again, they're under these restrictions that we aren't. They have the rule where they can't attach anything to the leader. So they can't add the indy. So they don't spend much time doing it. And so they don't talk about it too much.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're doing here, because we do this. Well, I do this a lot. I know you guys do. I fish with you. I'd say 40% of my time. I've thought about it. About 40% of my time, I'm using some kind of suspender. And I'll also say you can do a lot of the stuff we're talking about here with dry dropper tactics, although there's a lot of variations there. I'm going to say 40% of the time I'm using some kind of suspender, whether it's yarn or a bobber or a dry fly. Sometimes a suspender, especially with this indicator, is just the best tool, especially when you combine it with tight line tactics.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the more you can break down any barriers that you have to using suspension type tactics, the more often you will find that your fishing is more effective at some of the distances or across some of the currents that before you might have found challenging. Because I think it, like you said, it does offer just a really unique ability to create great drifts at distance in settings in which you normally wouldn't be able to either wade to that position, or because, there are a number of reasons why you may not be able to get to the particular seam that you're working for, or it's a little too far away. But I think everyone should think through why they're not using you should almost have to prove why you don't use a suspension tactic rather than prove why you are using one.
Well put.
I will say, I think it's one of my favorite ways to use it is out of a boat, because you're higher up. Like you're higher up you're basically standing on top of the water at that point. And so you can zing that thing for a longer distance because you can keep the line for, like, your line is even higher than where if you're waiting, you're kind of restricted by the depth of the current and your reach, where if you're floating on top of the water, you have a longer, higher reach. And so it's also great from a boat.
I think another thing is from a boat, it's very difficult to pure tightline. Yes. Pure tightlining is a wading tactic for the most part. But here, what we're saying, you can take these tightline tactics, throw an indy on there, and it is pretty special from a boat. Honestly, that's where I really started doing it the most. And then I said, ooh, I can do this while I'm wading too. Trevor, you really touched on something we want to talk about what makes this so special. Why is it unique? Why do you want to do this in the first place? And you're talking about fishing at a greater distance. When we fish on a tight line, pure tight line, cast upstream, cast over some, that fly, that nymph is going to track toward your rod tip. It's your rod tip that is in charge. And I don't care how hard you try, I don't care the design of the leader, that fly is going to track toward your rod tip. You can try to get it to not cross currents, but if you've casted further across currents than, let's say, 1 rod length away, then that nymph is going to track across towards your rod tip. By adding that indy, and this is maybe one of the biggest points in this whole discussion, now the fly tracks toward the indy and not your rod tip. And you can set this up where you don't have to mend. You do keep line off the water. That's another key thing. We're using this tight line advantage to the indy. So you can set it up so the fly lands upstream of the indy, and now you have all the line off the water to the indy. The indy is not being influenced by you or your line. It's only influenced by the top current, and then especially really influenced by the weight underneath, whether that be a fly or the split shot. And you can do this at greater distances when you can't wade into perfect position to pure tight line.
And so I'll add, I think that indicator adds like a pivot point.
Right on, yeah.
And so that indicator has mass in itself, and so you're keeping the fly line off the water, and that indicator has some mass. It, like you're saying, it'll track and kind of move in the current and hold like true into a seam, and with your slight tight lining or tension to that indicator, you're allowing it to kind of freely move through those seams.
Right. With the indy now being in charge of leading the flies down one seam, that's the real advantage. I like that word pivot. I often would say hinge. It's a hinge point. I think I like your word pivot better. I think that is better.
It's awesome.
Because imagine this. It's awesome. Imagine this. You can cast... Because imagine this. You can cast upstream at a 45-degree angle, let's say 35 feet. And now let it drift all the way down past you to a 45-degree angle. And if you get things set up right, the whole time it isn't going to track towards your rod tip. It's going to track toward that indy. And again, get things set up right where the fly lands in one seam and then the indy comes in right behind it in the exact same seam. And then it tracks downstream. It can go past you. And as you were saying, Bill, now that indy can act as a pivot point. I can be 45 degrees downstream of me, tight to my indy, meaning all the line off the water and tight to my indy, not affecting my indy, but just keeping the water, not hardly any tension, but not influencing it. And then the fly is still upstream of that indicator. And that's a very special thing that is absolutely impossible to do with a pure tight line approach.
Agreed.
So let me ask this. We're talking about keeping line off the water, tight to the indy. Is there a time and place to allow some line on the water?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a lot of situations in which I put down a few inches of line.
Yeah.
The wind strikes me as one of those opportunities when I want a little bit more surface tension affecting, I want something locking my rig in a little bit more than just the bobber itself.
Yeah.
Nice.
And so I'll put down 6 inches or 8 inches intentionally.
I mean, heck, I'll put sometimes 3 or 4 feet.
Yeah.
Controlled. But again, we have a lot more control over it with this tight line system. Also, it's a thinner line quite often than you would be fishing with a regular leader.
Yeah.
So you don't get as much tension to the indy when you're laying, even if you're laying 3 or 4 feet, if you're careful about it. But I'll lay 3 or 4 feet down if I'm really banging casts out there. And if I'm not in a lot of mixed currents, hey, here's the thing. If it's more advantageous for me to lay line on the water and I'm affecting the indy less, with less tension, right by laying 3 or 4 feet of line on the water, great. Then as soon as I can, I'll pick it up if that's a better thing. But if I pick it up and now there's too much sag on my leader and it starts pulling it toward me, then I've done the wrong thing. I probably should have just left line on the water. If I'm fishing at long distances and I plan on doing that and kind of doing little lift mends and things like that, mending, but yet I should point out, still staying in touch, just kind of repositioning that leader on the water, then I will grease it up. I think that can help. Sometimes I'll take the time to just grease that up so it just lifts right off the water. Austin, you do that a lot?
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it there. There's definitely a point in the distance of the cast and the amount of distance between you and your indicator that lifting that line off the water tracks the flies back to you worse than just leaving it there and trying to manage the slack that is in front of you.
Yeah, and you can see when to do it one way and when to do the other.
Yeah. That's the nice thing about the indicator is that it can talk back to you a little bit.
Yeah.
It
I like that.
Dips down side to side, backwards, forwards. You know what's going on there.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, if you're affecting the indy, then you're doing it wrong. The indy should just be doing its own thing. And yet you can be right in touch with it. Honest to God, sometimes if you have things set up perfectly, you can feel a strike. Now, if I'm saying maybe a fish eats your tag fly up above and it's pretty aggressive, right? You will feel the strike because you are trying to be tight to the indy and have the indy be tight to the flies. And you can feel it sometimes because it's acting, again, as Bill said, that pivot. It's acting like that pivot point. And you can feel it right through there, even though you're not affecting the indy. You're still in touch with it, just barely.
So one thing I do, when you talk about wind and you talk about kind of laying line on the water, if I decide I want to do that, I'll position myself and try to fish almost directly above me because most rivers, when you fish directly above you, that same current speed is going to be coming down at you. And so if you lay the line on the water directly upriver of you, there's going to be less seams to affect the line on the water.
Yeah, I'm with you there, Bill.
Yeah, that's important. All that approach angle kind of stuff is so important. Here's another key point. With no tension on the indy, we can trust what it's showing us. Just like on a pure tight line system to the sighter, once we have contact with the sighter, we can trust what the sighter is telling us. Well, if you get stuff set up now, you're watching the indy instead of watching the sighter, and you can trust what that indy is showing you. And what's it showing you? It's going to, if it's in touch with the flies, it's going to show you the speed of the flies. It's a mistake to think that that indy is always going to go surface current speed. It's not. There's lots of times you're going to see that indy just downshift. It's just all of a sudden the bubbles are sliding right past it. And your indy's going way slower than the top current speed. That's what I mean by we can trust it. When you see it going slower, you know that your nymph has reached the strike zone more than likely. And that is a really big deal. Again, we can trust it. We can trust that indy if we know that we have no tension to it. We're not dragging it across currents, and there's not line on the water that's creating tension on the indy.
Good point.
One of the items you touched on was like the casting and the landing of it, and I think that's really critical point to kind of talk through here. Cool. And so I don't know, when I work with guys, that's always the first thing I say is when your fly and indicator enter the water, the fly should always be above the indicator so that you
upstream.
Yeah, upstream. So that you're getting a true read, because if your flies land below the indicator, the flies are going through that current first and the fish can grab it and the indicator could float another 1.5 feet and the fish could eat it and spit it out. You never even know you had kind of strike detection. And that's where the indicator is super effective, but you need to understand how to land the flies and how to allow it to kind of float through the seam, because if you land the flies incorrectly, it's not going to represent what's happening to the flies under the surface.
And that's another time when you can't really trust it. What I see really most people do with any indicator system is they kind of throw it out there. The fly will often land in a seam that's across from where the indy was. Maybe it'll land 3, 4, 5 feet beyond where the indy lands. They're in two different seams. They're going to fight each other all the way trying to line up. And by the time they do line up in the same seam, getting a true dead drift, your drift is probably over. So lining them up You guys think it's easier to line things up on this tight line rig, this mono rig system, than with a fly line system?
I think so.
I certainly think so, but I do use it more. So I think I've become proficient with the mono rig to indicator system.
Right. I go back to a fly line rig fairly often. I still do it. I use a 9-foot leader and a fly line. And I actually do that from a boat a fair amount. But you don't have nearly the authority over the placement of the fly and then where the indy lands. You don't have it. There's not nearly as much direction.
I think the fly line kind of overwhelms it because you have the fly line and you have the indicator. So you have two kind of large masses flying through the air at that point. And so where the mono kind of takes his advantage is that indicator is the pivot point and it's the biggest mass. And so you're controlling it. And I think it gives you more accuracy with landing the indicator.
I say the mono is a pretty delicate material, and you can be you can fine tune the cast while it's in the air. We talked about previous podcasts being able to do like an aerial mend. So if you're casting across a current and you want to throw a mend in the air and land that bobber directly downstream your flies, it's a lot more easy to do on a mono leader than it is a fly line. Once again, going back to that mass, it just the fly line tends to just throw extra kind of inertia into the system and drag stuff places you didn't want it to go in the first place.
You're asking yourself to control two different things: the mass of the fly and the mass of the fly line. Or you guys are saying the mass of the indy. And when you say that, I keep thinking about how I use the yarn all the time. So let's dig into a little bit about indy styles. One of the reasons I love yarn. Yarn is my first choice. I use what I call it's a Dorsey yarn indicator because I learned it from Pat Dorsey. It's yarn. It's just yarn. It does not have that little black O-ring. It's just yarn. And then there's a rubber band. But it weighs almost nothing. So there really is no mass. And that's one of the reasons I love it. It's my favorite because it's so light, so it's extremely sensitive. And I feel like I can cast right through it and boss my flies around in a way that is very different than when I'm casting what I call a hard indy, which is, again, a bobber of some sort, whether it be cork or foam or plastic, What do you guys think about indy styles? I mean, do you use both?
I primarily stick to thingamabobbers, or I've used the corks a little bit. I've tried the airlocks, and they seem a little bit heavier. They are. And heavier, I think, maybe a little bit less sensitive to strike detection.
Yeah, that's fair.
Where the thingamabobbers I don't like the ones that have the kind of little peg in them.
No.
The thingamabobbers that come with those. If they come with those, I just cut them off.
Yeah.
And so I know I put them on differently than what you do. I just thread them through, kind of take it over to the thingamabobber, and it does kink the line a little bit. Where I'm going to be good, kind of explain how you use the kind of rubber band to go through and set those up with the thingamabobbers.
Well, if you look up how I do the Dorsey yarn indicator and how Pat Dorsey does the Dorsey yarn indicator, it's a 1/4 inch or 5/16 orthodontic rubber band. And I'm not going to try to explain that here. It's too difficult. But on the Troutbitten website and actually on the Troutbitten YouTube channel, you can find that. Anyway, I take that same orthodontic rubber band, and I rig up the thingamabobber the same way. But first at home, I take a piece of embroidery floss looped through that hole of the thingamabobber and then a knot in the end. And essentially, I do the same thing with that rubber band as I do with the yarn. Now I insert that embroidery floss tag that's sticking out of my thingamabobber just the same way as I would insert the yarn into my rubber band. And so I can slide it up and down. But I also sometimes then find that it will slide when I don't want to. If I'm casting aggressively and trying to get great position, again, fly entering in the same seam as the thingamabobber, then I find that it'll slide. But I don't want it to slide, so now I use a backing barrel. You can find that on Troutbitten too, to use that as a little bobber stopper. That backing barrel is just a 20-pound piece of Dacron tied with a uni knot, 5-turn uni knot. There's a solution to everything, right? And there's 100 different ways to do it. Yeah,
sure.
I think the main point for me is, though, there are different indy styles, and all of them weigh something. All of them weigh a good bit. The cork and the foam, even the foam weighs a good bit if you put it on a gram scale. And of course, the airlocks. I think the airlocks weigh the most. And the thingamabobbers are pretty heavy actually too, if you put them on a gram scale. But the yarn is really, really different. Austin, you use the yarn a good bit, don't you?
Yeah. You mentioned before it's your first choice, and I would agree with that. If I'm able to use yarn, I'll use that over the hard plastic. I touched on a little bit earlier is that the indicators can have a tendency to talk back to you, and there's not one that does it better than the yarn does.
Oh, that's so true. And that's because it's light. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so responsive. So the flies hit the water, your indies on the water. As soon as the slack's out of the system, you see that yarn indicator just stand right up.
It's like the wings point up. Yeah.
Exactly. It kind of rides on its side at the first, and then it stands right up.
I love that.
My flies are tight now, and
no other indy really can do that. And I've tried to find another indy that does it. I'll mention that the New Zealand wool, or the New Zealand indy system, that's yarn. It's a wool yarn. Yeah. And with a tube instead of a rubber band. It's real close. I almost like it as much, but not quite as much. It's not quite as versatile. But it's a great system too. It weighs almost nothing. And again, you can cast right through it and boss those flies around just in a different way than if you're trying to cast the indy, the weight or the mass, as we were saying, of the indy and now the flies. Not that that's hard, but it's different,
What's the biggest difference to you between the New Zealand style and the Dorsey style?
Well, this is slight, but I have an answer. It's the little bit of water weight in that tube. Sounds dumb, doesn't it? Right? It does. It sounds dumb. It's like that's what my grandfather.
Maybe just a little.
It's what my grandfather used to say was, "You're flying too low." Like you're worrying about it. But no, it's a little bit of water weight in that tube. Also, it's less adjustable because of that tube. There's a certain amount of yarn that you have to have in there to have the tension, to hold it together. And a lot of times, just today, we were using just a little bit of yarn for skinny water. On the Dorsey. We were using a Dorsey today, just a little bit of yarn. And then we went over into some heavier water. We used a big stonefly that I needed a lot more yarn. And so I used the same rubber band, and I just added yarn. And you don't quite have that versatility with the New Zealand style. Although they give you different, they give you different tube sizes, but also you have to have a tool with that. It is what it is. It's good too.
Yeah. Good point about the skinny stuff. That's one of the biggest appeals to me. Is that I can fish really low and skinny styles of water and still be able to use an indicator that doesn't totally spook trout when the thing lands.
So you're saying you think that splash can spook spooky fish?
Oh yeah,
yeah. We see it happen.
Yeah. Do you think there's any limitation as far as the flies that you can fish with a New Zealand versus a hard bobber?
Yes. Absolutely. And just today we did it. We needed to fish a stonefly. It was heavy enough to get real deep. Water was moving pretty good. And we kind of did too much. We had too much on there for the yarn. And I said, hey, we put an airlock on. I said, let's throw that on there. Again, though, one of the reasons we were fishing the tight line to the indy style is because we couldn't wade into great position. That water was moving. You know what I mean, Bill? You were there. And we could not wade into that perfect position to be one rod length away. We needed to cast at least 20 feet over and out beyond our position.
Corks I like because of their weight. They are really light. I feel like they land pretty soft. I also like the corks that I like the best are the ones that are half of the thing is painted, one like black and natural or white and natural. And I like that because kind of like Austin was saying with the Dorsey style, as soon as that rig is in contact, it will flip to the color, and so you really have the ability to tell that same piece of information out of it. I was curious for you guys that fish the Dorsey. To me, there's a pretty clear limitation when it comes to fishing that in the wind. And that may not be the case, but I fish indicators more often in the wind because of the advantages of that. And so I feel like going to the Dorsey as like my primary indicator would limit me a little bit in that respect.
So I fish indies a lot of times, not just in the wind. But when I'm dealing with wind, I'm going to go to the hard indy. And when I need more distance, I go to the hard indy. It's like, you're throwing a bobber. And now the weight of that bobber, you ever put them on a gram scale? Put that medium-sized thingamabobber on a gram scale. It's 65 centigrams. That weighs the same as a number 10 stonefly in my box. Tungsten bead with some lead wraps. Weighs the same as a stonefly. It doesn't seem like it. You put it in your hand. Anyway, so that thingamabobber has weight, and the airlocks actually weigh a little bit more. So I'll use that weight of the thingamabobber to my advantage. It could be an airlock. I'm using the weight of that hard indy to get me out there further in a way that the Dorsey or the yarn will hold me back. And that's why I love having both of them.
So help our good listeners understand here, because we've just gone through saying, oh, what are the advantages of indicators? They can fish at a longer distance and they're great in the wind. And those are two of our primary reasons for using them. And then you're saying, well, the indicator I use the most often is one that is neither the best at wind or distance. So for you, can you help re-explain a little bit of why that's your favorite?
Right, because distance and wind aren't the only reasons that I use an indy. You know, one of the reasons that I'll use an indy or a suspension system is even just to get a different look on the fly. I use it for a lot of different reasons, but imagine this one. A lot of times I'll nymph up through a run 100 yards and I'll catch 3 trout and I go, man, I should have done better than that. I'll go right back down to the bottom. I'll throw an indy on and it changes. It changes the drift. How does it change the drift? In my opinion, it gives us a truer drift through one seam than almost any of us can ever do. If you're going pure tight line, then you're asking your rod tip, or really you, to control the path of that fly, at least to some extent. And so when I throw the indy on, and again, when we set things up just right, and we have no tension on that indy, then that indy is going to drift down one seam. And it's going to lead that fly down one seam. It does a better job than I can. So maybe some days my game isn't on, and I'll throw an indy on, just because I think it's going to do a better job than my rod tip can. Other days, I think my game is on, and it just changes the drift. Imagine this, too. I'll point out one more thing. When you throw the indy on, now the indy, we're trying to get the fly to be in touch with the indy pretty soon, if not immediately, pretty soon. Now, let's say we're fishing a riffle or a run, and that water's kind of bobbing up and down. You know, the surface of the current's going up and down. Well, now that fly is going to go up and down every time the indicator does. And it's that subtle little up and down motion that perhaps is a real trigger for trout. All I know is that lots of days when I'm nymphing, and I feel like I'm tight line nymphing really well, the trout aren't eating. One of my first things to do is say, all right, throw the indy on, see what happens. And usually I'll go to the Dorsey. Usually I'll go to the Dorsey because it is more sensitive, because the thing's awesome. It's super nimble on the water. And then if I need that distance, and if it is windy, then I'll use the hard indicator. So there are a lot of different reasons.
I like that. That's great. Yep.
So do you guys change your casting techniques when you're throwing an indicator versus a tight line?
Certainly depends on the style of indicator.
It does.
For example, on the Dorsey, I find a traditional fly casting stroke is pretty natural for me.
Nice.
When I'm fishing a heavier rig, say with a hard bobber or thingamabobber with maybe some split shot on there, a traditional casting stroke is doable, but it's a little less smooth. And in that case, I prefer to the style of a waterhaul cast is best for me. It limits the amount of loops I'm making in the air. It's more or less just a straight shot to my target. Less chances for things to be tangling or grabbing each other in the air as they turn over. So yes and no.
I think when and I primarily use a hard indicator, but I almost do like an oval cast that is probably most similar to the type of cast I'm doing with a streamer because of that weight. And I'm sort of like bringing the line up and around and then shooting it forward at the end of the cast. And that shooting forward kind of provides a little bit of a tuck to the honestly, the weight's probably just hitting at the indicator, but that bit of whip drives the flies.
It's nice.
And if you get it, like it takes me a few times every time to get back into the swing of it. But once you get into that rhythm, you're just throwing those flies correctly in that same seam as the indicator. It's nice. I feel like it works really well.
That sounds like, I think, what I do the most with that oval, coming around, stopping kind of higher and allowing that fly to enter first. And then you have control also of where the indy goes. Yeah, I open things up. And like you said, it's very much for me, very similar to the way I throw the streamers. And I think that's, again, because you have weight up there. I love what Austin, you said about when you have the Dorsey on, you could really stick with your standard fly line cast, even though, again, we're throwing a mono rig. Bill, what about you, bud?
I'm pretty much the same. One thing I always key and focus on is when I'm trying to cast an indicator, I'm stripping my line back to me, and I have, I would say maybe to my first like knot where I only have maybe 4 or 5 foot of line out of the guides of the rod, and so the indicator, all the flies are out of the water. And so when I'm casting forward, it's I almost call it like, I think it's like your oval cast, but I think of it as like almost like a spinning rod at that point, because you come forward. One thing I try to do is not like, there's no back and forth. It's just one motion of take it back. With the indicator, I try to pause a little bit more because there's more mass there. Let it load the rod, come forward in just a short cast, make an abrupt stop, and just force the indicator to just kind of push out.
And like you said, it's almost like a spinning rod, similar to how we're casting streamers a lot of times. Like you said, you'll strip in and you start with not much out. And then you can shoot all the whatever line that you recovered. You can shoot it out. What takes it out? Well, partly it's your cast, and it's partly the mass of the leader, which we're going to talk about that leader design in a second. But it's also the mass of the bobber, if you're using that. And then, of course, your split shot or your weighted flies.
And one big advantage of it is if you're like fly line, you need room to back cast to get distance, unless you're going to roll cast.
Yeah, right on.
But with the indicator system, if you have kind of tight brush or something behind you where you don't have the room to make a back cast, you can kind of do that oval cast and just almost with, the length of your rod, and you can still get a lot of distance out of it. That's where I think it comes in handy quite often when you're fishing tighter quarters too.
I love that. That's sweet. Good point.
Yeah, I know we hit on this earlier, and Bill, you talked about it a little bit, but we want to make sure we emphasize the importance of being in one seam when you're fishing with the indy to tight line system. And the importance of that, a lot of it just goes back to getting a proper dead drift, right?
Yeah.
Because we want a dead drift, and a dead drift requires that your indicator be in the same seam as the flies, or else, just like can happen when you're not using an indicator, you're going to constantly be tracking across seams as that drift establishes. And in a world in which there are different current speeds across those different seams, you are going to be watching your indicator fight those different current seams. And you're also going to be faced with a period of time where your flies are not tight to the indicator, and you may have limited strike detection for 25%, 50% of your drift until it establishes true dead drift capabilities. And during that first period of time, you may be missing strikes that are occurring because you're not tight to your system. So if you don't learn a proper casting stroke in order to put your flies in the same seam as your indicator upstream of that indicator, you might as well not use this tactic.
I agree.
When we put the indy on, everything we were doing beforehand doesn't just go out the window. All the same principles we use in a tight line system of using a sighter, all those principles transition perfectly over to using an indicator.
Absolutely.
You can really have a really consistent mindset throughout using both sides of the tactics.
Oh, that's such an important point. So I want to point this out too. The way to get everything in line, which is tough. You look at it and you watch somebody do it. I mean, I can face the bank and get everything to line up in one seam. Meaning I can face that bank, I can cast and get the fly to land in, let's say the bank seam, and I can kick that indy over in the same bank seam. And yet I'm casting directly across from myself. That seems like a little bit of magic at first when I show people that, but it's just time on the water. But the way to make that happen is to get everything, whatever. We talked about the different styles of casting. You got to figure that out, but you want to make sure that everything turns over first. You need a fly first entry. I'll call it a tuck cast, but the tuck cast is so more than just, I want to get down quicker. Yeah. So it's a tuck cast, but it's a fly first entry. It's a turnover cast. You want things to turn over. The fly goes in first, and now that indy still has momentum, and it can continue on its path, let's say bankside again, it can keep going, and now it can land in that same seam. That's how you do it. That's the best maybe we can say it verbally.
And I would say one thing to kind of keep an eye on, if you're fishing your indicator and you're kind of in contact with it, and you notice the indicator kind of starts shooting downstream, what happens, like if you do land out of that seam and your fly is in a different seam than your indicator, sometimes that fly will shoot down river and it almost looks like a the fly turns into like the dog pulling the owner down the sidewalk of just your indicators. Just like if it's shooting downstream, that's a good indication that your indicator is not in the same seam as what your fly is.
Right on. And the more you do this, the more you realize that, if you have tight line principles taken to the indy, again, we have the line up and off the water. Now you can, again, trust what that indy is showing you, and you start to really learn how you can read that indicator with the things that you were just saying, Bill. There are all kind of strange things that the indy will do to kind of show you, oh, I need to correct this in the cast next time.
Yeah. So do you guys prefer to use an indicator in different water types, like one water type versus another?
That's a good question. I don't know that one water type comes to mind. If the weighting is more difficult, I think I'm quicker to throw it on to get into seams that are further away from me that I would typically be able to get to. So when the water's up, I know I'm using it more. When I fish with my kids and I have them in a backpack, I fish with the indicator a lot because I have trouble being as exact as I need to with the monorig direct to the fly because of the weight of the kid in the backpack, and they're shifting around a lot. And so my balance is constantly off a little bit. And so the indicator gives me a little forgiveness.
Yeah, sure.
What about you guys?
Most often I find myself fishing them in scenarios where places I can't reach, or the water depth is greater than what I feel like I can effectively reach with a purely tight line system.
Yeah.
I'll use them in all water types.
Yeah.
But that's probably the one I find myself going towards most often.
Right. I think most people would say that, hey, slower water, I'm going to use an indy. Hey, faster water, I'm going to use a pure tight line system. I would agree with that. Okay. And there's certain waters that jump out. Well, there's certain water we call bobber holes, right? I mean, especially in the wintertime, sometimes places around here, trout will sort of congregate in some particular kind of water. It's these bobber holes, right? And we call them that because they're most effectively fished with a bobber and not even the yarn, because again, I want to get further out there than the yarn can take me. And you can set up nice long drifts off in these areas, kind of have a uniform depth and a uniform bottom. You're not running into rocks. You can get long drifts through there, run a pair of nymphs. Those bobber holes, they just kind of scream for the bobber. Hey,
absolutely,
fish the bobber.
I'm ready.
But you go upstream of there, and then I feel like taking a bobber off because I love tight line and pocket water and fast water and shoots and runs and stuff like that. But yeah, like you guys said, I'll use the indy in any type of water. If I can't reach it, if it's windy, lots of reasons to throw it on. And I won't let the water type stop me from throwing an indy on.
I guess my favorite water type to fish an indicator is one that does not have complex seams. I feel like that's the one kind of weakness that the indicator has. Because if you have those complex seams where there's large boulders, large rocks that kind of cause complex currents, kind of,
that's fair,
seams that come up. Like my favorite water to fish it in is kind of like a long gravel riffle that may start out skinny, get deeper, but it can be very fast. It can be very slow, but I prefer like those kind of like that gravel run because it doesn't have those complex seams to cause the indicator and the fly to get kind of out of touch.
Gotcha. I like it.
One thing I wanted to bring up before we're done here too is just the necessity to be willing to and able to adjust for depth in our systems for you're going to use the tight line to indicator rig. I think, we could all acknowledge that by putting an indicator on your line, you are removing the ability to as easily tailor your depth within a particular drift
for sure.
on the fly, and that's one of the huge advantages of Euro nymphing and
tight lining.
Mono rig nymphing is tight lining, right? Is the ability to fish a drift with multiple depths within that same drift and to adjust for it on the fly. But so we put the indicator on, we have a static fixed object. We can't do that anymore within the drift necessarily, or at least not as easily. So then you got to be willing to have an adjustable system, or else you're really going to limit yourself pretty heavily.
Right.
So how do you guys do that with the style of indicator fishing that you do?
Yeah, right. Because once it hits the water, your adjustments are done. Once it hits the water, all we're trying to do is keep the tension off of that indy. And again, we're trying to keep all the line up all the leader up in the air. So I always hated Indy systems until I did it this way. And I always hated Indies until I found the Dorsey. For me, one of the things I really loved about the yarn system with the rubber band is it is so easily slidable up and down. It does not damage the line. You can mount it on 4X. You can even mount it on 5X. It'll go up and down. It doesn't crimp or damage the line. Super, you bring it in 10 seconds, 5 seconds. And then, like I said earlier, I took that rubber band and made the thingamabobber slidable up and down the same way.
One other way that I adjust for depth, besides a slidable system like you just described, Dom, is control to my casting stroke. So if I don't want my flies to hit or drop through the column so fast, I will land those flies with less slack or more tension in the system.
Nice.
If I want them to drop faster, I'll do the opposite, incorporate slack or a harder tuck into the cast. Another thing I'll do is just kind of manipulate the time at which my flies achieve depth. So if I don't want to change depth or add weight, and I'm fishing a certain section of a run, I may cast up further than I have been and allow more time for the flies to reach the depth that I want them to reach by the time that they get there. So it's not necessarily I'm changing anything. I'm just giving it more of a chance to do what I want it to.
Yep. Back to that tuck cast, I think you'd find a lot of people that say, what a tuck cast? And with an Indy rig, you don't need that. But again, not only just to force the flies down faster or have them drop slower, but we touched on it earlier, and it's important. You turn the flies over, and then you have ultimate positioning. Fly goes in. Now, where do you want the Indy to land?
Yeah.
You're in the same seam. Yeah, you pick.
Yeah.
That's right.
A lot of times I adjust the flies as far as weight goes, particularly the bottom fly. Most times I fish an indicator rig. I'm fishing it in an area that has somewhat of a uniform depth, and so I know that as long as it's not like a raging spot, a lot of times I'll underweight my flies so that once it gets down there, they're a little bit more natural. They're not pulling on the indicator as much. Or if I'm fishing a really fast spot, I'll just adjust the bottom fly and put a heavier fly on.
Yeah, right on. Hey, so one more thing here, and maybe a lot of people would have started with this, but let's talk about the gear for a second. Rods, reels, and leader build. What do you use for rods?
I mean, I like to use I don't use typically more than a 4-weight because I like to fish back and forth with my tight line system as it is. But I like a 4-weight for fishing indicators because of the backbone that gives me and the ability to cast it and not get pushed around by that extra weight on the leader, especially if I'm fishing a heavier rig with the indicator. And then I have a 10.5 foot 4-weight that I like a lot. I like that added length because I can get a little more line off the water and I can accentuate the advantages of that tight line to the indicator system.
Nice.
And fish even further.
When we did the other podcast on the versatility of the mono rig in general, I know we all talked about our favorite rods. And what I noticed is that we all are fishing, let's say, heavier rods than specialized Euro nymphing rods that are often 2 weights or 3 weights. 3 weights good. 3 weights fine. 3-weight can do this. It's not going to hurt the rod, but it takes a long time for extra weight to load. And especially if you're using a bobber instead of the Dorsey. I'll also say too, if you're trying to push that Dorsey, it's not even about just throwing extra weight, but if you're trying to really kind of push that Dorsey that has wind resistance or air resistance to it, I don't want that rod to flex so much, maybe. I like a more powerful tool in my hand.
Yeah. I like the really fast rods.
Yeah.
Like I said before, 2x4 with some eyes on it.
Yeah. Right.
And I like if I know I'm going out to a river that I'm going to fish indicators frequently, I will definitely take a 10-foot 5. That's my kind of go-to on bigger river systems that I know I'm going to fish an indicator a fair, like I would say over half of the time, I would prefer to take a 10-foot 5 that's a very fast rod that I can quickly turn that indicator over. I don't want to take it back and wait for it to load. I want to just be able to kind of zip it out there.
Yeah. So I've written about, I guess what I now call the Troutbitten standard mono rig for a lot of years. And for so many years, people would say, well, why do you have that leader so thick? Or why do you use a 4-weight instead or a 5-weight instead of a 3-weight or 2-weight? Well, this is exactly why. It's because I need that versatility. I want to be able to do everything on the water. I am going to spend a lot of time pure tight lining, and then I'm going to throw this Indy on there. And then I need more power. I really do. I want more power in the rod, and I want more power in the leader build. So for me, it's a 20-pound butt section because that 20-pound, it pushes things around. I was just using, I'm always experimenting with leaders, and I've been using a 12-pound a lot. I've been doing a lot of tight lining, hardly any suspender nymphing for the last month. And then it has been windy. Trevor, like we were talking about, you throwing the indy on there. And so I figured, well, here we go. I'm going to throw it on there, and this 12-pound is going to get a real test. So the 20-pound has a lot more power to it. And when I was using that 12, it would get the job done, but I had to work a lot harder. And it did get to a certain point when it got real windy that it was too floppy out there. My distance was actually limited because the leader did not have enough power to push things around and place things with that authority of positioning that I really wanted.
Do you think without the wind that 12-pound gave you more, like a better drift?
Less sag.
Yeah, less sag and more, I guess, more sensitivity. Did you think it was an advantage? Take away the wind on a non-windy day. Do you think the 12 is? What do you think with it with an indicator?
Yeah, cool. So I've fished that a lot too, and so I feel like I can clearly say it doesn't give me any more sensitivity at all in this system. If you're pure tight lining, it does. The thinner your butt section is, the more sensitivity. If we mean sensitivity by feeling perhaps the weight on the river bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah, on a pure tight line, yes. On this system, no, I don't feel like I get any more sensitivity. But without wind, I still prefer the 20-pound because I can push everything around more and put it where I want it. Yeah, I'll have less sag, but as we talked about, we can defeat that sag by putting a little bit, 3-4 feet even, of the leader on the water, the sighter maybe. If you tuck things in, you get things lined up right, it's not a big deal. It's on the water for, 3-4 seconds. It gets closer to you as it's coming back downstream, and then you can lift it up. You can mend it, as we talked about, sort of little reach mends. I like that ability to really push things around with this more stout leader. And that's a huge reason why I've stayed with the standard mono rig, the 20-pound butt section through the years.
I still fish the 30-pound OPST laser line.
That's the same diameter as the 20-pound chameleon. It's actually a tiny bit thinner, but anyway, just to clarify, it's not thicker.
Right. I guess, is that a higher rated braking strength?
It's just a braking strength.
The 30-pound?
Yeah. But it's the same. It's actually 0.0165. Whatever. Now I sound like Trevor.
Not that, yeah.
I think going back to why is this not so popular, a point earlier, is that often people are fishing these tight line rigs with specialized tools,
yes.
The 2 and 3 weights. And when they try to put a heavy indy rig on that rod, like you said, Dom, it's pretty undergunned. And it doesn't feel too good. It may not work very well. And when that happens, you generally don't go back to fishing those tactics again. And on average, we're fishing kind of beefier rods for that reason.
Oh, yeah. That's a sweet point. All right, guys, I knew that was going to be a good one. Good discussion. I love it. So I often make the point or make this argument that tight line or contact nymphing tactics can't be beat. That using the tight line advantage is almost inarguably the best way to get great dead drifts while having control over the course of the flies and great strike detection. But what I mean by that is not just pure tight lining, because tight line to the indicator style is also part of my system. When it's the best tool for the job, then putting an indy on a tight line rig is a deadly variation. We all build our leaders to be ready for it. The rods we carry are designed for it, because tight line to the indicator is a problem-solving approach that gets the job done when pure tight lining simply cannot. And I spend about 40% of my nymphing time with some form of suspender on the line. Once again, there's a lot more information about the specifics of this on troutbitten.com. I'll put some of those links to those articles in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and thanks for supporting the Troutbitten podcast. Trevor, will you read us out?
Troutbitten.com is a free resource for all anglers, so dig in and check it out. Navigate through the menus and find what you like. Share it, leave a comment. Use the search page if you're looking for something specific. Navigate by way of the categories and tags too. Thank you for listening. Please give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and leave a comment, because that really helps. Until next time, friends, fish hard, enjoy the day, and find your life on the water.